There's never been a better time than 2024 to own a SEGA Saturn. I highly recommend you get one now. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let me flash back a little bit to whenever I was 14 years old. The SEGA Saturn had just released, and I wanted nothing more than to own a SEGA Saturn. I wanted to relive the arcade experiences like Virtua Fighter, Daytona USA, and the House of the Dead. I wanted these arcade experiences at home, and the only way that I could get these arcade experiences from Sega at home was via the SEGA Saturn. Well, at the time the SEGA Saturn was released, it was $400 in the US, and the PlayStation ended up being $300, so it was $100 less, and Sega never recovered. But honestly, I've been pretty disappointed with the gaming industry as of late, which is why I've been collecting older consoles. I've got a SEGA Saturn now, I've got a Sony PlayStation, I've got a Nintendo Wii, a Super Nintendo, so I've got all the stuff that I could need to survive the apocalypse and enjoy some games. But it was late last year in 2023 when I finally decided I'm going to go ahead and buy a Saturn now. And it was the best damn decision I've ever made. It's nice. And I'm going to explain why owning a Saturn right now in 2024 is the best decision you can make as a retro gamer. You can buy the SEGA Saturn console for as little as $100 as of right now, as of the time of this recording, which is a heck of a lot cheaper than what the Atari Jaguar is going for right now. Holy crap, are you going to spend $500 on a Jaguar? Didn't think so. So the Saturn is actually cheaper now than it was whenever it was new, so that's already a huge win, because if you've been paying attention to the retro gaming market lately, you'll know that everything has just exploded in price and value. It's totally insane. But the Saturn still remains moderately priced, especially if you get the original Japanese Model 1 like I did. I paid like $100 for this thing, and it came with 2 controllers, power supply, everything. It came with the whole package. And it doesn't really matter which one you buy. If you buy, the Japanese version, the US version, it doesn't really matter because there are ways to get around the region lock and everything. So what I did is I actually installed a Fenrir Duo into my Saturn. This is an optical drive emulator, or ODE. This basically replaces the optical drive with a little card that has an SD card, a micro SD card slot in it, and you can load your games onto that micro SD card and play them directly on the Saturn. And it's a perfect example of modern technology fusing with this older game tech to create a better experience than ever before. I've got over 100 games loaded up onto the micro SD card, and as soon as I load up the game, it starts running. It works great. The SEGA Saturn itself doesn't know that it's loading games from an SD card. It thinks it's reading a disc, and that's what's so amazing. What else is amazing is the fact that it was so easy to install. All I needed was a screwdriver, and I just take off the shell, unplug the optical drive, plug in the Fenrir, you're good to go. It's so easy. It's one of the easiest mods ever, and it's one of the best things ever for the Saturn. I totally recommend it, because you're playing the original games on the original hardware. It's just the method of delivering that game to the system has changed, and it's way better. And the Fenrir Duo hasn't been around for a terribly long time. It's been a couple of years, but man, is it a good investment, especially if you want to play some old games. Games that don't require day one patches or internet connections or for you to sign up to a service or anything like that. You just turn on the game, start playing the way it was meant to be. I also personally recommend the Action Replay 4MB expansion cartridge for the Saturn, because there are a few games, a handful of games, that require that 4MB expansion pack to run, like Final Fight Revenge, for example. I love that game. It's such a silly game, and it's only available on the Saturn. But the Action Replay also doubles as a cheat device, so if you want to add extra lives or skipping levels, stuff like that, you can add that using the Action Replay, and I think it's pretty cool. I don't use the cheat feature so much, but it is cool to have, and it's cool to play around with. And there are other 4MB expansion cartridges out there that you can buy. This is just the one that I recommend. It's what I've been using, and I've had no problems at all with it. I've also replaced the battery on this thing, which you have to do every 2 years or so. The battery retains your system settings and your clock settings and your game saves. And that's another thing that you want this 4MB expansion cartridge for, is you can transfer your game saves from the internal memory to the cartridge and back again. So if your battery dies, you can have a backup of your saves in the expansion cartridge. There's also a mod that you can have installed that replaces your system memory with persistent RAM, so you never have to replace the battery again. That's available from Stone Age Gamer and probably some other sites as well. So I may or may not do that in the future, because it is a cool idea. I like the thought of having my game saves always on the Saturn, never having to worry about the battery dying. So I might do that in the future, but I'm fine for now. but the option exists, and that's what's awesome. They also still make a lot of the replacement parts, like you can still buy ribbon cables, the optical drives, various pieces and parts to the Saturn are still available to purchase in case you need to do some home repairs, you know what I'm saying? They even have cool accessories like this Bluetooth controller adapter. There's the Brawler Gen 2-in-1 controller. You have the Retrobit Saturn Pro controller. That's great. It's pretty good. And you have all these replacement shells that you can buy for your Model 2 Saturn. So there's lots of accessories and lots of cool stuff that you can buy for the Saturn that you couldn't buy back when the system was current. Oh, and one last thing. How could I forget this? The community. The Saturn community has delivered in spades. What do I mean by that? Well, a lot of games for the Saturn only released in Japan. There was a lot of Japan exclusives for the Saturn, and I'm going to blame Sega of America for that one. They really screwed themselves over. A lot of the best games on the Saturn only came out in Japan. Now, fans have actually translated a lot of these games into English and other languages, so you can play them as they were meant to be played, and that is friggin' awesome. Aside from the translations, there's also ROM hacks and improvements. Like take the Symphony of the Night hack, for example. It basically fixes a lot of the problems that the Saturn had with its version of Symphony of the Night, which only released in Japan, by the way. But it takes that version, which does include content that you can't find in the PlayStation version, and it fixes all the little bugs, all the little problems that the Saturn had. It's almost perfect now. I love playing it this way. I love playing with the Saturn controller. I think it's a perfect controller for these kinds of games. I actually like it better than the PlayStation controller by a lot. And you can still buy a lot of the original accessories for the Saturn without breaking the bank, like this SEGA Stunner. That works perfectly, by the way, for Virtua Cop and House of the Dead. I friggin' love this damn thing. This looks a little bit too real. If I walked outside with this, someone would call the cops. I'm not joking. It has a good weight. And it sounds good too. Wow. This is a good light gun. I need like a cigarette in my mouth to complete the look. And some facial hair kind of growing out a little bit. So the end of the story, I have my SEGA Saturn, finally. 14-year-old me is very happy, and I get to play all the Saturn exclusives, and even the ones that aren't exclusive. It's cool to play a lot of the games that are on the Saturn that are also on the PlayStation because they are slightly different. They're not like the identical game in most cases. Mortal Kombat Trilogy is basically identical. It's 1-to-1 with some minor graphical differences, but other games like Alien Trilogy are somewhat different. Each version has its own strengths and weaknesses, and it's cool to see those differences. There's Resident Evil, there's the Capcom fighting games, which by the way are better on the Saturn. Absolutely. If you're an old school Capcom fighting game fan, you're going to love the Saturn if you haven't already purchased one of these. The Saturn has basically arcade perfect ports thanks to the 4MB expansion cartridge. Oh, and the controller, of course. The controller is the way to go. It's got 6 buttons on the front, which is the way to play these kinds of Street Fighter-esque games. So that's basically this whole video. I want to convince you to purchase a SEGA Saturn, get a Fenrir, load it up. You will have hours and hours of fun, and you'll not know what to play next. And that's a good problem to have. If you have so many great games, you just can't choose. That's a problem you want. Well, that's all I got for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I just wanted to open your eyes to the possibility of owning a Saturn in 2024 if you haven't already purchased one. It's definitely a good investment. I highly recommend it. You won't be disappointed. I promise. You have my word. I'll see you soon.